There are 4 Bible passages about the Russian conquest of Western Europe that is about to take place in 2020, I believe. 2 passages are in the Old Testament and 2 are in the New. Number 1, Daniel 7, verse 8, speaks of 10 horns that stand for 10 kings. But kings rule nations. So we can take these 10 horns, these 10 kings, to mean 10 nations. And now, chapter 7, verse 7, introduces the Roman Empire, which is Western Europe, synonymous with Western Europe. The ancient Roman Empire splits up into many nations, but these 10 nations that we're talking about are a subset of that larger group of nations that came out of the Roman Empire. To be specific, these 10 nations are 10 Roman Catholic nations because they are the 10 horns stay with the 7 heads. 7 heads are 7 hills of Rome. And the 10 horns stay with the 7 heads, or with Rome, in 2 different periods. The period of the empire, but also the period of the whore. Enough said on that. What happens is, quote, another horn comes up among the 10 horns. That's in verse 8. It comes up with great force. This obviously is a prediction that one nation will invade the 10 nations of Western Europe. There'll be many more that also get invaded, but it's concentrating on this subset. Since Russia is close enough and predatory enough and powerful enough to do it, we must conclude that Russia is a conquering nation. Okay, we move on to number 2, which is Daniel 11, verse 40. It says, the king of the north will invade many nations to the south. It will sweep through them like a flood. Now, why is the king of the north talking about Russia? Why is the north Russia? Well, in the very next verse, it says the king of the north will invade the beautiful land, which is talking about Israel. And this is set in the end time, which is specified in verse 35. Everything after 35 is set in the end time, because it mentions the time of the end in verse 35. Now, I'm not talking about the end of the world, I'm talking about the end of the church age. Now, we cannot say this is Russia, the north is Russia, by itself. The evidence comes from the fact that Ezekiel 38 and 39 says the north, the king of the north, will invade Israel in the end time, and it specifies that the north here is Magog, which means Russia, and the king is Gog, which means Gorbachev. So if the invasion of Israel in the end time in Daniel 11, verse 41, equals the invasion of Israel by the north, it specifies that Magog is to the far north, the uttermost north. If they're the same invasion, then this gives us evidence that the king of the north in Daniel 11, verse 40, equals Russia. Now I have to give some background about the king of the north. In verse 36 and 37, it says he will oppose God, he will speak against God, and he will magnify himself above God. And then in verse 45 of Daniel 11, it says he will come to the beautiful holy mountain, which is talking about Mount Zion, which is the location of the temple. Now, these four aspects are what Paul, the apostle, uses and describes about the man of sin. He will exalt himself above every god. He will oppose God, which is the same thing as speaking against God, and he will magnify himself. That's from Daniel 11. Now in 2 Thessalonians, the man of sin claims to be God. And so we have a rough parallelism. Plus, it says he will sit in the temple of God, which would be talking about Mount Zion. It would be actually the Muslim temple, which is over the site of the Jewish temple. Long story short, I'm saying the king of the north in Daniel 11, verse 36 through 45, is the basis for Paul the Apostle's Paul the Apostle calling, he calls him the man of sin, but it's the same guy. It's a new name for the king of the north. And this is the same man that is called the beast, who makes war against the Christian countries and overcomes them and gains power over every nation. In other words, the whole world. This is from Revelation 13:7. So the idea is the king of the north conquers the world. The problem is, in the first half of Daniel 11, the king of the north means the king of Syria. And Syria is a small nation. It cannot possibly be the nation that conquers the world. So what do? Well, all we have to do is think about what Syria has become a part of. It is now part of the Russian alliance. Russia has gone out of her way to save Syria from becoming liberated from the dictator Bashar Assad. Russia is defending Syria, and this emphasizes, this clarifies, this underscores that Syria points to Russia. And so it's like a seed. You plant a seed in the ground, it becomes a tree. It grows into something much bigger than itself. And Syria, the king of the north starts off as the king of Syria, but in the second half of chapter 11, he morphs into the ruler of Russia, the Russian alliance, of which Syria is a part. This enables the king of the north to be the conqueror of the world, because he's the ruler of Russia, and Russia is a nuclear superpower that can conquer the world if they can knock off the United States. If they can knock off the United States and conquer Europe, they basically have the world. They don't have to go out and conquer every country. They basically rule the world by knocking off the United States and gobbling up Western Europe. Now let's get back to Daniel 11, verse 40. It says the north will conquer nations to the south, many nations to the south. Now how can we make that? How can the south mean Western Europe? Because the south of Russia, Western Europe is not south of Russia. But if we go by the model of the Syria-Egypt wars in the first half of the chapter, this gives us the ability to take the word south to mean the southwest, which would mean Western Europe. And the idea is Egypt is called the south. But actually, Egypt is not south of Syria. Egypt is to the southwest. Actually, you could simply say Egypt is to the west. And using that model, we look for an area southwest or west of Russia to be the victim nations. And So that's the answer. 2 down and 2 to go. We turn now for 2 examples or 2 passages in the New Testament. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 5, verse 6 says the man of sin will be revealed in his time, in other words, in the future. But it says the mystery of iniquity is at work even now, in other words, in Paul the Apostle's time. It says the iniquity is already at work. Now, the iniquity here is the particular iniquity that is tied to the man of sin. Now, what we can do is we can take the activity that is going on in Paul's time as a precursor of what will happen later on in the future when the man of sin comes on the scene. Now, what was going on in Paul's time? Well, the Roman Empire was the restrainer, acting as a restrainer to keep back the warlike tribes coming from the east, Eastern Europe. And you could actually say Russia, but you don't really need to. Just say Eastern Europe. And so we can take Paul's words to mean that what was going on then is a picture of what will occur in the end time. The same stalemate. The West holding back the East. But then it says the man of sin will take the restrainer out of the way. It doesn't say that. It just says he will be taken out of the way, but we can interpret that to mean taken out of the way by the man of sin, overcoming the restrainer, overpowering the restrainer, which would be the same thing as in Paul's day. In other words, Western Europe. Western Europe back then was the Roman Empire, but Western Europe today is NATO, the NATO alliance. The NATO alliance will be overpowered by the Eastern forces, in other words, Russia. Let me say one more time, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 6 and 7 imply the Russian invasion and conquest of Western Europe. And now, by extension, Russia bombs America because America is the leader of NATO, the alliance that Russia will overpower and destroy. So it only makes a good sense to think that if Russia takes Europe, they're going to bomb America. Try to understand that. How can they do that? Well, we've disarmed, so we're opening the door to them. We're inviting Russian attack by our foolish disarming. Now, in the same passage, chapter 2, verse 9 through 11, it talks about the people believing the lie and then perishing. The way that works out is the West has believed the lie that Gorbachev told back in the 80s, and for the last 30 years, the West has been disarming. America and Europe have been disarming, and now we're ready to be bombed because our arsenal is so small. It's unbelievable. We had 39 subs, boomer subs, and now we're down to 12. Actually, it's the equivalent of 11. Now on to number 4, which is Revelation 20. Verse 8 and 9. Verse 7 has the devil coming out of his prison at the end of the 1,000 years. And the very next verse, verse 8, ties that event to Gog and Magog invading Israel. in verse 9. That's 7 through 9, verses 7 through 9. Now, the idea is the Satan here equals a dragon in the first part of chapter 20 of Revelation, and the dragon there equals a dragon in chapter 12 of Revelation, and there he is described as having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now this identifies him, this reveals that he is nothing more than the beast with the 7 heads and 10 horns, and that in turn, that beast is nothing more than the beast in Daniel 7 that has the 10 horns. These 7 heads are added, but it's the same beast. And it's simply talking about the Roman Empire, and the dragon or beast coming out of the abyss is simply talking about the return of the Roman Empire, and that's simply talking about the return of one-man rule over Western Europe through the conquest of Western Europe. That removes the nation's sovereign leaders, and the ruler of Russia becomes the ruler of Europe. So it's one-man rule, the restoration of that, and that's the return of the so-called Roman Empire, and that's what is talked about in Revelation 20, verse 7, and then that's tied to Gog and Magog, and the idea is the linkage there is a hint that Russia is the cause of the return of the Roman Empire. And now I should go back and explain that the millennium in chapter 20 is nothing more than a veiled description of the church age, which is the time from the cross of Christ to the second coming of Christ. The thing that convinced me that about that the millennium is nothing more than the church age, when I saw that the Gog and Magog passage, the verses, verse 8 and 9 in Revelation 20, is a parallel to Ezekiel 38 and 39, Gog and Magog there invading Israel, I realized, my God, the millennium is the church age. In Ezekiel 38:39, the invasion of Israel is set at the end of the church age. And then I realized, if that's the same invasion that's in Revelation 20, at the end of the 1,000 years, that means 1,000 years equals the church age. And I mentioned that to somebody, and they said, well, that's the St. Augustine's interpretation also. And that was the interpretation of the church for the first 1,000 years of the church age. And then they went astray and dumped that interpretation. What evidence is there that the millennium equals the church age? Well, at the beginning of the millennium, there is the first resurrection. And at the beginning of the church age, there is Christ's resurrection. And that is that's our resurrection of the church, because the church is in Christ, and his resurrection is our resurrection. So the first resurrection of that's at the start of the millennium does fit the resurrection at the beginning of the church age. Next, we move into the middle of the millennium. That's where the church rules with Christ. And sure enough, that parallels the middle of the church age, where the church was progressively accomplishing the Great Commission, in other words, ruling more and more of the world. We took over Europe, then missionaries went to Russia, and that was Christianized. The Vikings were Christianized in the 800s, and Russia in the 900s. And then in the 1500s, the the Great Commission extended to America, North America, South America. And so the middle of the church age does fit what is described in Revelation 20 about the middle of the millennium. And finally, at the end of the millennium, there is the invasion of Israel by Gog and Magog, the return of the Roman Empire in Europe, and that fits what happens at the end of the church age. And the Great White Throne at the end of the millennium equals the second coming of Christ. What's nice about this theory, or this approach, this interpretation, is that if we're at the end of the millennium, once we get past the Russian conquest of Europe and the bombing of America, once we get past that, once we have the second coming occur, then what happens is we get into the new heaven, new earth age, and we don't have to wait 1,000 years. The new heaven, new earth begins with the second coming. And what about the destruction of the old earth and old heaven that Revelation 21 verse 1 speaks about? Well, that's the nuclear war. A nuclear war destroys the surface of the earth in the big cities of America. And it destroys the ozone layer, which is a part of the first heavens. So you can say that the first heavens and the surface of the earth are destroyed, so that fulfills the destruction, and that's in Revelation 21 verse 1, and also 2 Peter 3 verse 11 through 13, or 10 through 13. But it's only the surface of the earth, not the whole earth, and certainly not the universe. It doesn't have to be taken as the second heaven. Rather, it can be taken as the first heaven, which is the atmosphere around the earth. A nuclear war will destroy the ozone layer in the northern hemisphere temporarily. And that's why Revelation 16, I think it is, says that 15 or 16 says that the sun will be given power to scorch men. The ozone layer that protects people will be temporarily gone. And that's why the sun's rays have the scorching effect. As usual, I'll give a transcript in the description box underneath the video.